Hi, Modern World History students. We're continuing unit number 8, the Second World War, and this is section number 4, which we're also continuing from our previous lesson, the strategic bombing and the Battle of Britain. So in the previous lesson, I introduced you to what strategic bombing is. The idea here is that rather than attacking targets on the ground that your soldiers are fighting against right now, that's tactical bombing. In strategic bombing, you're attacking the facilities that allow a nation to supply its army with the war materials it needs to fight the war. So you're attacking factories and warehouses and railroads and bridges. So not only the production and storage, but the distribution of war materials. And you're attacking oil refineries and fuel storage tanks and pipelines for the production and distribution of fuel. You're trying to make it impossible for your opponent to provide what the army needs to fight the war. That's strategic bombing. And we showed you how that when Adolf Hitler in the spring, early summer, late summer really of 1940, when Adolf Hitler began to plan for the invasion of Britain, he started with strategic bombing. And that's where we'll pick up the story again. And we'll continue to tell the story of the Battle of Britain. And today you'll particularly focus on why Germany lost the Battle of Britain. So we're moving to the bottom of page 10 in your unit packet. So remember that at the beginning, Hitler's plan for the invasion of Britain was to start with a 6-week campaign of strategic bombing to really destroy the ability of Britain to defend itself against an invasion. Remember that what Hitler was proposing to do in invading Britain was to do something that hadn't been accomplished successfully in almost 900 years. No one had successfully invaded the island of Great Britain in almost 900 years. And Hitler said, if we are going to be successful, if Germany is going to be successful, we're going to have to start with strategic bombing. We must destroy the ability of the British to provide their army with the war materials they need to defend their island. So the first, sort of part of the attack on Britain was 6 weeks of strategic bombing in July and August of 1940. The thinking being that the strategic bombing would come to an end by September of 1940, or mid-September, at which point they could launch their invasion. But if you remember, things didn't go quite as planned. The British proved to be excellent in terms of the organization of their efforts to repair and replace and rebuild things that the Germans had bombed. So the Germans would bomb a railroad bridge. Within a week, it would be replaced by a pontoon bridge. The Germans would blow craters in an airfield. Within a week, those craters would be repaired and airplanes would be taking off and landing again. The Germans would damage a factory, and within a week, the factory would be operating again. Maybe not at full capacity, but operating nevertheless. And so as German pilots flew back and forth over the targets that they had bombed previously, they were reporting back to Germany that, the targets were being rebuilt and repaired and replaced. And so at the beginning of September, it was decided to extend the strategic bombing into mid-September. And that would delay the invasion, but that was okay because it was felt that the invasion could happen as late October. After that, it really wasn't possible. The English Channel, that little portion of the Atlantic Ocean that separates the island of Great Britain from the rest of Europe, would become impassable. The English Channel would become very rough, the weather very unpredictable. You couldn't launch an invasion. But that was, but now it's September, and so you've got some time, and so extending the strategic bombing for a few weeks into mid-September should be all right. But even then, it didn't matter. And they extended it for another week into sort of late September. And still it didn't matter. The British were repairing, replacing, and rebuilding. And so Adolf Hitler changed the strategy for the attack on Britain. And he decided that the real issue was the morale of the British civilian population. Hitler realized that Churchill had the British civilian population turned up to a pretty high frenzy. They had played a huge role in the evacuation of British soldiers from Dunkirk. That had proven to the British population that they could play an important role in winning the war. And now they were out there rebuilding, replacing, and repairing. And so Hitler concluded that the only way to make this work was to destroy the morale, to demoralize the British civilian population. And so he ordered a shift in the bombing from true strategic bombing to what's called terror bombing. So in terror bombing, you're no longer identifying specific targets to be bombed, this factory, that railroad bridge, but you begin bombing cities. And in particular, you begin bombing residential areas, housing. Because residential areas are very large, they're easy targets, and the hope, in Hitler's view of things, was to demoralize the British civilian population, to bring the terrors of war to them so that they would become demoralized by destroying their homes, by murdering their children. This would destroy the morale of the British people, and they would no longer be motivated to sort of repair and replace and rebuild. So in late September, the German bombing shifted away from true strategic bombing to what's called terror bombing. And this was the part of the Battle of Britain, as it was called. The Battle of Britain, the only battle of the war fought entirely in the skies. And this is when the Battle of Britain shifted to sort of a second phase, phase two, which was known as the Blitz, or better yet, the London Blitz, because so much of the bombing focused on the city of London. You have to keep in mind that basically half of the population of the island of Great Britain lived in and right around London. That was the major residential center of the entire island. So the focus of the Blitz was on the city of London itself. This is not to be confused with Blitzkrieg, the German army's method of attacking Western Europe. It's simply called the Blitz, or the London Blitz. And now the Germans are going to be bombing people. They're going to be bombing residential areas in an effort to demoralize the British people. And so the city of London took the brunt of it. And some of these photos help to show you the great and important landmarks of the city, the famous landmarks of the city, and areas right around them that were under attack. So here is Tower Bridge with the neighborhoods around it under attack. Here is St. Paul's Cathedral, which is basically the entire neighborhood around St. Paul's was struck by what are called incendiary bombs. The Germans used percussion bombs, which shake rigid structures like buildings to the ground through the force and shock of their explosion. The Germans also used incendiary bombs, which start fires and would burn out whole sections of the city. And so London was subject to massive bombing, and I'll show you just how massive when I visit a website with you in a few minutes. But the entire city of London was under attack. Whole sections of it were destroyed. How did Londoners cope? Well, for one thing, they sent children out of the city. Whenever possible, families who had either family members or friends living in the British countryside sent their children to live with relatives in the countryside to get them out of the city where the intense bombing was taking place. If you've ever seen or read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, this is the sort of premise of the story. The children are sent out to live with relatives in the countryside. Even the king and queen sent their two daughters out into the countryside, including one who became Queen Elizabeth II, who is the current Queen of Great Britain. She was already a teenager. She didn't spend much time in the countryside because during the war, Queen Elizabeth, well, not yet Queen Elizabeth, she's simply called Elizabeth at that time, she grew into an age where she could join the British Army, and she did as a mechanic. And to this day, Queen Elizabeth II can change the oil on her car if she wants to. It's hard to think of a queen that way, but she absolutely was a mechanic in the British Army during the war. But anyway, the children were sent into the countryside. The adults remained in the city. They had essential war work to do. If Britain was to defend itself against a German invasion, the adults of London could not also go and retreat into the countryside. They had to stay in the city and go to work in the factories and in the offices because their work was essential to the defense of Britain. And so they remained in London. The King and the Queen remained in London. Winston Churchill remained in London, all during the full extent of the Blitz while the bombing was going on. You could see Churchill by day, as you see here, examining the wreckage, examining the damage, talking to people who had lost their homes. He went on the radio, as he always did, to keep the British people motivated. And the King and Queen remained. They stayed at Buckingham Palace, which is their palace in the city of London, for the duration of the bombing. This was all to sort of keep the morale of the British people intact. Keep calm and carry on. That was the slogan of the British people during the London Blitz. How did they cope? Well, during the day, the British, the London citizens, they would go to work. They would do their essential war work. And at the end of the day, they would come home, they would make dinner, they would eat dinner, and they would pack a bag with the next day's clothing, and they would go to bed. And sometime during the night, because nighttime was when the German bombers usually attacked, it was harder to shoot them down at night. And sometime during the night, the air raid sirens would begin to scream, and that was the signal for the British people to take shelter. So they would grab the bags that they had prepared, and they would go down into the subway stations, and they would ride out the bombing during that night, sleeping as peacefully as they could on the platforms of the subways and even in the subway cars themselves. And when morning came, they would get up, they would go into the washrooms, the bathrooms in the subway stations, wash their face, brush their teeth, put on their clothes that they had packed in their bag, and they would go to work. Maybe they would inspect the damage to see if their home was still intact, but they would go to work. And they would do their war work for the day. And when the day was over, they would start over the whole process again. So the British civilian population, the Londoners, those who lived in London during the Blitz, really were quite a remarkable group of people. They could not be intimidated by the bombing of their city. They were going to continue to do their work. They were going to continue to keep calm and carry on, even though their city was being bombed all around them. And even though 50,000 of them were killed. The German bombing of London killed 50,000 British civilians. But it was an error. The decision to shift from true strategic bombing to terror bombing was a mistake on the part of Adolf Hitler. Because although the cities were now being bombed, although the residential areas were being destroyed and tens of thousands of civilians were being killed, in taking his eye off the ball, in not bombing factories, that meant that the factories were free to operate, which meant that they could produce war materials, including fighter planes, which could eventually enter the skies and enter into the battle against the Germans. These are the famous British Spitfire fighter planes here. In not bombing airfields, it meant that pilots could be trained to fly these planes. And so it was truly a mistake. It was a strategic mistake by Adolf Hitler to shift from true strategic bombing, focusing on factories and airfields and railroads and bridges, to bombing the cities. It was a mistake not only because, in the end, the British civilians did not allow themselves to be intimidated, but also it allowed British factory production, aircraft production, pilot training to resume full go. And as a result of that, by late October, the tide of the battle was turning. The balance of power in the skies over London was turning against the Germans and in favor of the British. The British had two things going for them as well. They had broken the Germans' code. The Germans sent their messages from their high command out to their air bases in code, and the Germans believed that their code was unbreakable. But a team of code breakers, British and Polish, many of them, by the way, women, who were mathematicians and who were using their mathematical skills to decipher the German messages. They had broken the German codes. And as a result, the British now could listen in and know what the German high command was instructing their air force to do. So the British knew in advance sort of where and basically on what days the Germans would be attacking, like where the attacks would come from, what parts of the city or what parts of Britain would be targeted. They knew that in advance because they could read the German messages because they had decoded the German code. They had broken the German code. The other thing that the British had developed was radar, which is radio detection and ranging. And the way that radar works is you broadcast radio waves out into the air. And if they don't hit anything, they just go on out into space. But if they hit something solid, like a flight of German bombers, then they reflect off of that and they bounce back and they come back and you have a receiver to receive the echoed radio waves. And that receiver then can tell you what direction the German planes are coming from, because what direction are the waves bouncing back from? That's the direction of the German planes. How far away are they? Because the amount of time it takes the echo to come back tells you how far away they are. And if you send out multiple echoes and you measure how the amount of time is shrinking, all right, that means the planes are getting closer, and you can calculate how fast they're coming and when they will arrive. And so in between having more planes and pilots to intercept the German bombers, because Hitler had stopped bombing factories and airfields, plus having the German code to give you a sense of when and where the attacks were going to come, and then having radar to specify exactly what direction and when the planes would arrive, that allowed the British to really focus their air defenses on the area where the German planes would be arriving and overwhelm the Germans with a fighter response and start shooting down German planes. And by the end of October, they were shooting down way more German planes than the Germans were shooting down of theirs. And more German planes were getting shot down than could even release their bombs. Here's a German plane that was actually shot down right on the grounds of the Palace of Westminster, which is the home of the British Parliament. And as a matter of fact, over the course of the Battle of Britain, the British shot down 2,000 German airplanes. The British had about 900 of their own planes shot down as well, but they shot down 2,000 German airplanes. And as October rolled over into November 1940, the Germans simply had to give up their hope of an invasion, because now autumn had come and the English Channel was becoming too rough and the weather too unpredictable. So the Germans eventually had to give up their plans for the invasion. The British civilians in the city of London and the pilots of the Royal Air Force had delayed and delayed and delayed, and now the Germans couldn't make their invasion. The bombings continued for a few more months, but the height of the Blitz was over and the danger of a German invasion had passed. I want to show you real quickly a website that's called bombsite.org, which seeks to document the London Blitz. And it has a record of every bomb that fell on London during that 2-month period or so. And each of the bombs is represented by a red dot. A single bomb simply have a bomb there, and you can click on it, and it'll show you here was a high explosive bomb that was dropped at this location. You can go into more information if you want. But what I think is really remarkable is if we follow the Thames River, which is this river here, if we follow it around to this location here, this is actually the Palace of Westminster, which is the headquarters of Britain's Parliament. And you can see that 2 bombs actually fell on the grounds of the Palace of Westminster itself, damaging the Parliament building. The Germans certainly were targeting the core of the British government here. And additionally here, so I mentioned to you that the King and the Queen had remained in London during the Battle of Britain, during the Blitz. They had sent their daughters out into the countryside, including the current Queen Elizabeth II. But they had remained in London, and this is their palace. This is Buckingham Palace. And you can see that the Germans tried to hit Buckingham Palace. Bombs fell all around Buckingham Palace, about 15 of them, but none of them actually struck the palace itself. So it's quite a remarkable story, the way that the citizens of London resisted the efforts of the Germans to demoralize them by destroying their homes, destroying their city during the London Blitz. And if you want to really understand the scope, the scale of this attack on the people of London, we just start to zoom out and we start to look at all of these dots, which represent, in some cases, multiple bombs being dropped on the city. And the more and more we zoom out, we begin to realize how thoroughly the city was bombed by the Germans, the intensity of the bombing, and the sheer scope and scale of the German bombing of London during the London Blitz of the late summer of 1940 and early fall. But it failed. The attack on London failed. And so the Germans had to give up their plans to invade Britain. Now, I like to joke that Hitler was so frustrated that he didn't get to invade Britain that he decided to take out his frustration by invading the Soviet Union instead. That's not quite true. But our next section is the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And I hope that you'll be able to explain why that invasion included major strategic errors that ultimately led it to fail. So we're going to move to the top of page 11. And the first thing I want you to realize about the German invasion of the Soviet Union is that um, it was certainly something that Hitler had planned for a long time. Okay? If you go back and you remember that Hitler had written this book called Mein Kampf while he was in prison in the early 1920s, 1923, and he had written in Mein Kampf that the German nation required Lebensraum, living space. And that didn't necessarily mean space for German people to live in exactly, but it meant that the German nation would require farmland in order to grow the food that the German nation would need to continue to grow and thrive. It was one of the fastest growing nations in Europe. And that farmland, Hitler said, was to the east. It was located to the east. Poland, Ukraine, Western Russia. This was the breadbasket of Europe, some of the finest farmland in Europe. And Hitler intended to take it for Germany, and he states that in Mein Kampf. And so certainly Hitler was planning the invasion of the Soviet Union for a long time. You say, well, yeah, but in August of 1939, Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, an agreement with Stalin not to fight. Well, I think both sides knew that that was not a permanent non-aggression pact. Hitler certainly knew it. He intended to break that non-aggression pact because he intended to invade the Soviet Union at some point in the future. And Stalin, if he had read Mein Kampf, if he was paying attention to anything, he knew it too. That this non-aggression pact was a temporary arrangement that benefited both sides. It benefited Hitler and the Germans because Hitler believed that Western Europe must be conquered first before invading the Soviet Union. Otherwise, Germany would have to fight a two-front war. He wanted to eliminate Western Europe, particularly France, as a threat before beginning his invasion of the Soviet Union. A non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union guaranteed that he could focus on beating France without being attacked by the Soviets. Stalin needed that non-aggression pact because, of course, he was trying to modernize and industrialize the Soviet Union and build up its army. He knew in August of 1939 that that process was not complete. And so in signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler, he bought himself some more time. So both sides were happy for the non-aggression pact, but both sides knew it certainly wouldn't last. Hitler definitely knew that. Stalin should have known it. So now Hitler was preparing to invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. But by that time, you can see that the rest of Eastern Europe had already come under German control. You might notice that my map has a few items added here. I'll give you just a minute or two to explain what happened there. Italy, remember, had their own ambitions. Mussolini's goal for Italy was to become the dominant power of the Mediterranean. And so Italy had invaded Greece. But the Italians had found fighting the Greeks to be very, very difficult. Greece is the second most mountainous country of Europe. And Greek militias, that is, irregular army, like amateur soldiers, had fought the Italians to a standstill in that mountainous country. And now the Italians needed help. So Germany, just like in World War I, Germany has to keep coming to the rescue because Germany has weak allies. Same thing in World War II. Italy proved to be a very weak ally. And so Germany will have to come to the rescue in Greece, just as they had to come to the rescue of Austria-Hungary in World War I. So German forces invaded Yugoslavia and defeated resistance there, and then moved on into Greece. And once the Germans moved into Greece, they were able to defeat most of the Greek resistance as well. Now, for what it's worth, guerrilla warfare continued against the German occupiers throughout the war in both Yugoslavia and Greece. In the meantime, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria had actually joined the Axis powers, not because they necessarily agreed with Adolf Hitler's philosophies or his ambitions, but perhaps, number one, out of intimidation. I mean, it seemed like Germany was certain to win this war, and you probably wanted to be on the winning side. But also, all three of those countries had ambitions of their own to take over additional territory. And by joining the Axis, which seemed to be sweeping across Europe and conquering all the land that they wanted to, these three countries felt that they could, perhaps by joining with Germany, have territorial gains of their own. So Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria became allies of Germany as well. So that helps you to understand why this part of the map is colored in the way it is. Not something I want you to really focus a lot on, but I wanted you to at least tell you that part of the story. But let's get back to the main part of the story, which is the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which Hitler named Operation Barbarossa. He constructed the largest invasion force ever assembled. Um, Remember that when Napoleon Bonaparte had invaded Russia back in 1812, he had assembled an army of 600,000 soldiers. When Adolf Hitler was planning for his invasion of the Soviet Union, he assembled an army of 3 million men. Approximately half of those were infantry, and the other half were, tank commanders and truck drivers and artillerists and pilots. Okay, so an army of 3 million men, 5 times the size of Napoleon's army, and just the infantry alone was almost 3 times the size of Napoleon's army. There were over 100,000 artillery pieces, 7,000 tanks, 7,000 airplanes, a massive, massive invasion force, the likes of which had never been seen and has never again been seen in the history of human warfare. He named the invasion of the Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa, which is kind of strange. So, Frederick Barbarossa was a medieval emperor. He was an emperor of what was called the Holy Roman Empire. Remember that Germany didn't exist at that time. Germany didn't exist as a country until 1871. For a long time, Germany was just a bunch of, these sort of broken up, fragmented, disunited states. And an attempt had been made in the late medieval, early modern period to bind them together into an empire under the leadership of a person called the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Holy Roman Empire was sort of Germany before there was a Germany. And the Holy Roman Emperor was sort of the ruler of Germany before there was a Germany. Frederick Barbarossa had been a Holy Roman Emperor. He had assembled a German army to go and fight during the Crusades. So I suppose Hitler was choosing to name his operation after an emperor who had assembled a massive army to move east and invade eastern lands. Perhaps that's why Hitler chose the name Barbarossa for this invasion of the Soviet Union. Whatever. It's a strange name, but that's what it was called. So Hitler now took his invasion force and he divided it into 3 groups. Not so creatively named Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South. Each of them had a Soviet city that was targeted. So Army Group North targeted Leningrad. So you say, wait a minute, that's St. Petersburg. Yep, this was St. Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia during the time of the Tsars. It was also called Petrograd during World War I. After Lenin had died, after Russia had been taken over by the communists, and then after Lenin had died, the communists who ruled the Soviet Union decided to name the city in his honor. So it was known as Leningrad from 1924 until 1991. And now it's called St. Petersburg again. Army Group Center targeted Moscow, which of course was the capital during the time of communist rule. It was the capital of the Soviet Union, and it was sort of the nerve center, the command center from which the entire Soviet war effort was being conducted. That is where Stalin was. Army Group South targeted Kiev, which is today the capital of Ukraine, and was a major industrial center. And when the invasion began, the Soviets seemed to be taken completely by surprise. Again, Stalin must have known that the non-aggression pact would not last forever, but he seems to have hoped and believed that it would last longer than it did. So when German forces began their invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Stalin seemed utterly unprepared for it, and the Soviets seemed pretty much unprepared for it as well. German forces advanced very, very rapidly, driving Soviet forces backward and backward, in some cases hundreds of miles, in the first weeks of the invasion. And the Soviet army seemed to have no planned method for resisting this invasion. In the first 48 hours, Joseph Stalin essentially disappeared. He made no communication to his army on how they should fight back against the German invasion. He seemed to be shocked himself and almost withdrawn at what had happened. And so In some cases, entire sections of the Soviet army, they don't respond to the German invasion, and German forces, German tanks will race around them and trap them from the rear and capture whole huge Soviet armies. In the first 6 weeks of the invasion, the Germans had already captured 500,000 Soviet soldiers. 500,000 Soviet soldiers captured by the German army in the first 6 weeks and sent west into prisoner of war camps, which were essentially like concentration camps. Here you see certainly tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers crammed into one of these camps. However, Stalin eventually woke up or whatever he was doing, and he began giving commands. And the commands that he gave to the Red Army, to the Soviet Army, were very similar to what we saw from the Russians when they were invaded by Napoleon back in 1812. Stalin told Soviet troops, buy us time. And you're going to buy us time by retreating. And you're not going to retreat in a panicked, undisciplined way, but you're going to retreat in a steady, controlled way to draw German forces into the heart of Soviet territory, but to buy us time. You need to buy us time so we can sort of regroup and prepare to fight back. And so Soviet forces began a slow and deliberate retreat into their own territory, drawing the Germans in. He also ordered them to do what the Tsar and what Kutuzov had ordered Russian troops to do to Napoleon. He ordered them to harvest whatever grain was ready to be harvested. Now, not much was ready to be harvested. This is late June of 1941. Generally speaking, you don't harvest until August or September. But what was to be harvested, what could be harvested was to be harvested. What could not yet be harvested must be burned. You must not leave it for the Germans. Similarly, livestock, any animals that could be used for food, horses to be used for moving, pulling carts and things, cows for milk and meat, chickens for eggs and meat, pigs for meat. Any of those things, all of those livestock had to be driven by the Soviet army with them or shot so that their bodies would rot and not be useful to the Germans. Sometimes villages were burned down so that they could not be used by the Germans for shelter. And something that they had not had in 1812, which was new to this new invasion, Stalin, of course, had focused most of his time as the leader of the Soviet Union on modernization and industrialization, that is, building factories. Almost all of these factories were located in Western Russia because that's where the major population centers were. The factories needed labor, so they built the factories close to where the labor was in the big cities. But now those factories threatened to be overrun by the Germans. But even as they were built, Stalin ordered plans for them to be dismantled, loaded onto railroad cars, and transported 500 miles to the east in the event of an invasion. The planning for this went back almost 10 years because he knew. Remember, part of the reason he was so anxious to get those factories built was his belief that another war was coming. And so even as the factories were being constructed, the plans were in place to dismantle them and move them 500 miles to the east in the event of an invasion. And now Stalin ordered that to happen. This was risky. Now, of course, if they stayed in the West, they would probably be overrun by the Germans anyway, and they would no longer be available to the Soviets. But in dismantling the factories and relocating them and reconstructing them, this meant that there would be a period of a year to a year and a half when the Soviet Union would not be able to build war materials because their factories would be in the process of being moved and rebuilt. So the Soviets are going to have to ride out the first year at least of this German invasion on what war materials they had constructed at the beginning, right? They were going to have to be able to rely on what they had in order to get through at least a year to a year and a half before they could start building new war materials again. That was going to be a very dangerous, risky time for the Soviet Union because they didn't have much. It wasn't as bad as World War I, but they didn't have much. Could they make it? That was the big question. Could they survive that year when they weren't building war materials? Could they do it? That meant that the Germans then, on the flip side, they had approximately 1 year to win the war. Because if the war dragged on against the Soviets a year and a half, 2 years, and the Soviets got their factories rebuilt and they started producing their own war materials again, that was going to make it very hard on the Germans. So There's a critical year here from sort of mid-June 1941 through maybe the end of the year 1942, where Germany has their best chance to beat the Soviet Union and where the Soviets are at most risk because they're not building weapons. They're rebuilding factories. Okay, so let's move down to the bottom of page 11 and talk about the strategic errors that Hitler made. Now, as I mentioned, the Germans advanced very rapidly in the first few weeks of the invasion, and even after that, they sort of advanced steadily because the Soviet strategy was to retreat, slowly and in a controlled way, but nevertheless to retreat. And so, by the winter of 1941-42, let's say by December of 1941, German forces, Army Group North, had actually surrounded the city of Leningrad and they were besieging the city. Army Group Center had pressed to within about 20 miles of Moscow, which was the capital and where the entire war was being run. Army Group South, meanwhile, had overtaken Kiev, captured the city, and had moved beyond it to try to capture the Russian oil fields beyond. And so the German invasion seemed to be a great success. And yet, even in this success, you can see the seeds of Germany's defeat, not just in the invasion of the Soviet Union, but even in the war. So 3 major strategic errors that Hitler made. Let's start with the first one. How about invading the Soviet Union? How about that? That's a pretty big error. And it was a particularly large error because Britain was still out there. Hitler had given up on his invasion of Britain and had turned his attention to invading the Soviet Union. And his generals begged him not to do this. His generals said to him, look, if we turn our backs on the British and we focus on fighting the Soviets, then at some point the British will gather up their strength and they will attack us in Western Europe. And particularly if the United States becomes involved in the war. If we leave Britain as a base for US forces to join with the British and attack Western Europe, you will condemn Germany to fighting on 2 fronts. By leaving the British out there, by not finishing off the British before invading the Soviet Union, the potential is that Germany will be condemned to fight a 2-front war. And the whole point of the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union was to finish off Western Europe before invading the Soviet Union. Now Hitler was sort of abandoning that plan. And so number 1 strategic error was in invading the Soviet Union before finishing business in the West, invading the Soviet Union while Britain was still alive and kicking, because in the end that will lead, after the entry of the United States, into Germany being forced to fight a 2-front war, actually more than that. And that was a problem, and that was a major contributor to Germany's ultimate defeat. Another strategic error in the invasion of the Soviet Union was in taking this massive invasion force, the largest ever assembled in the history of the world, and then dividing it up into 3 parts, each of which was still quite powerful, but not nearly as powerful as if they had all been held together and launched in one massive assault on Moscow. Moscow was the city that counted. That's where Stalin was. That's where the entire Soviet war effort was being operated out of. And if the Germans had been able to capture Moscow, maybe even capture Stalin himself, probably the Soviet war effort would have simply fallen apart, disintegrated. But Hitler didn't do that. Instead of concentrating his entire invasion force on Moscow, he divided it into these 3, and his goal was to gobble up as much Soviet territory as he could, living space, agricultural land, and also to sweep as many Slavic and Jewish people into his Holocaust as he could. Now, one might say that if he had concentrated on Moscow and defeated the Soviet Union, then the rest of those things would have fallen into place, but Hitler didn't seem to grasp that. And instead, he spread his army out to accomplish these other goals instead of focusing on a drive on Moscow, which might have been successful. So that was error number 2. Strategic error number 3. When German forces entered the Ukraine, they were greeted as liberating heroes. The Ukrainians showered them with gifts and cheers, because remember, they had been treated so badly by Stalin. Because the Ukrainians had resisted Stalin's collective farming, Stalin had begun a genocide against them. He had killed 7 million Ukrainians. These Ukrainians would have been happy to mobilize against the Soviet Union. Hitler could have had maybe 2-3 million more soldiers to assist with his attack on the Soviet Union if he had simply mobilized the Ukrainian population, who would have been happy to join him. But he didn't, because they were Slavic people whom he considered subhuman and whom he wanted to exterminate. So instead of mobilizing the Ukrainians to help him fight the Soviets, he sent them off to the concentration camps to die. So another pretty major strategic error. So Hitler made multiple strategic errors in his invasion of the Soviet Union. And in the end, that'll lead to the failure of the invasion and to the defeat of Germany in the war. So we'll get there eventually, but in our next lesson, we're going to shift gears and we're going to go over to the Pacific Theater and East Asia and talk about the outbreak of the war there, resulting from Japanese aggression. So that'll be our next lesson. And until then, I hope you're able to stay healthy and safe. Take good care of yourselves, modern world history students. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.